Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fifth chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. We have seen that both the search for causes and the examination of means lead into the field of theory, that is, into the field of universal truth, which does not proceed solely from the case immediately under examination. If there is a theory which can be used, then the critical consideration will appeal to the proofs there afforded, and the examination may there stop. But where no such theory truth is to be found, the inquiry must be pushed up to the original elements. If this necessity occurs often, it must lead the historian, according to a common expression, into a labyrinth of details. He then has his hands full, and it is impossible for him to stop to give the requisite attention everywhere. The consequence is that, in order to set bounds to his investigation, he adopts some arbitrary assumptions which, if they do not appear so to him, do so to others, as they are not evident in themselves or capable of proof. A sound theory is therefore an essential foundation for criticism, and it is impossible for it, without the assistance of a sensible theory, to attain to that point at which it commences chiefly to be instructive, that is, where it becomes demonstration both convincing and sans réplique. But it would be a visionary hope to believe in the possibility of a theory applicable to every abstract truth, leaving nothing for criticism to do but to place the case under its appropriate law. It would be ridiculous pedantry to lay down as a rule for criticism that it must always halt and turn round on reaching the boundaries of sacred theory. The same spirit of analytical inquiry which is the origin of theory must also guide the critic in his work, and it can and must therefore happen that he strays beyond the boundaries of the province of theory and elucidates those points with which he is more particularly concerned. It is more likely, on the contrary, that criticism would completely fail in its object if it degenerated into a mechanical application of theory. All positive results of theoretical inquiry, all principles, rules, and methods, are the more wanting in generality and positive truth, the more they become positive doctrine. They exist to offer themselves for use as required, and it must always be left for judgment to decide whether they are suitable or not. Such results of theory must never be used in criticism as rules or norms for a standard, but in the same way as the person acting should use them, that is, merely as aids to judgment. If it is an acknowledged principle in tactics that in the usual order of battle cavalry should be placed behind infantry, not in line with it, still it would be folly, on this account, to condemn every deviation from this principle. Criticism must investigate the grounds of the deviation, and it is only in case these are insufficient that it has a right to appeal to principles laid down in theory. If it is further established in theory that a divided attack diminishes the probability of success, still it would be just as unreasonable, whenever there is a divided attack and an unsuccessful issue, to regard the latter as the result of the former without further investigation into the connection between the two, as where a divided attack is successful to infer from it the fallacy of that theoretical principle. The spirit of investigation which belongs to criticism cannot allow either. So we continue with the fifth chapter that, as I told you last time, and we usually do on Schwerpunkt, being a long text and being effectively not split in paragraphs needs to be discussed one chunk at a time. So essentially, here von Clausewitz goes on observing, after having seen what's the object and the means of the critical inquiry and the narrative that comes out of it, with its judgment over a military event that can serve for the construction of the theory of the art of war, reflects a bit more deeply on which are effectively the limits of historical inquiry in that regard, and how should the historian specifically relate with the pre-existing theory and, let's say, an individual, if you want, critical approach to the subject, I mean, history as such, but also the theory that stems from it. Now, this is very important because, as I've told you many times, I've made these premises many times, von Clausewitz actually talks straight to historians when he is writing this book, because he realizes that everything that serves to the purpose of building up a theory of the art of war, with all the limits that it has by definition, however, is founded on military experience. So whether it's direct of command or indirect through, history books, but the point is fundamentally the same, right? And this could be treated just like with any historical subject, right? Not just with the military one. Even if we have seen that military history has certain specific characteristics, and more in general is of let's say, of more, ethical weight in general, because effectively, if doctrine is built over these inquiry, well, this is a big deal for even realizing what will happen on the field, where that theory is applied as a doctrine, right, methodically speaking. That's what we're talking about here. So, as always, here von Clausewitz swings between the extremes, right? Von Clausewitz is very clear about that the theory in itself has certain absolute boundaries that have to be considered to give instead a dimension to the normally limited set of notions that is contained in them. So, one thing is the intention, one thing is naturally what you will concretely do, in real life. And he starts with this phrase, in fact, that says, "We have seen that both the search for causes and the examination of means lead into the field of theory." Right? So, first of all, he actually addresses this mythological side of the story, that not only criticism is founded on this search between this connection between the causes and the consequences, right? That should always be cleared, right, and illustrated in order to build a chain that can sustain the theory, but also the means, right, that were available at the time to the commanders that were, protagonists of those military events you're studying, so that you can make a bit more of a theoretical jump directly and say, okay, how would I have employed those military instruments fundamentally, right? So this this thinking and the amalgamation of such ideas brings to the field of theory as such, because it's not just descriptive but prescriptive, is analytic and synthetic, right? So, and then he goes on and says that is into the field of universal truth, which it does not proceed solely from the case immediately under examination, right? So the ultimate goal, the absolute one, is in theory, right? Reaching, let's say, making overlap theory to the universal truth. And naturally, here you don't have to freak out when you read this from Clausewitz, because the first one, it says, look, this is just a theory. In fact, we're not saying that you can effectively achieve this, that you can make theory overlapping with universal truth, right? Also because that would be unexpressible also in the ways we with our poor cognitive means in the first place, right? So it's effectively impossible, but the idea is that there is naturally a truth somewhere, and important is getting closer and closer to that, so at least getting it right from the directional point of view. And for this purpose, that in fact he says, it's not just a matter of saying, from theory, building theory from an individual set of circumstances, but in fact theoretically thinking it as, there should be a theory that could cover everything, right? And it is obviously impossible, but the ultimate aim of theory is basically having this set of notions that can fit with the majority of of situations, in this case of warfare, and naturally that is not achievable, right? But the idea is, there is a balance fundamentally between this absolute tension and reality as we experience it, and also how we, in fact, we try to extrapolate this set of notions from in order to build the theory. In other words, the theory is as important as it is of practical use. And here, in this chunk of the chapter, von Clausewitz observes how this is effectively possible, how the balance should work, right? He says, if there is a theory which can be used, then the critical consideration will appeal to the proofs there afforded, and the examination may there stop, right? So here it's the paradox, right? If theory was right in every time, you basically wouldn't need critics anymore, right? You would simply say, okay, I apply this theory, making a doctrine as a method, and it will go, right? This is impossible, naturally. So from this follows that criticism must always stay behind theory. And actually it's the most important thing, because maybe when you think about that military event ex post, it's one matter. Okay? You're mostly in fact theoretically oriented, but when you have to you're fighting effectively, you have the theory next to you. Well, at that point you're maybe not thinking excessively about theory, you're just busy doing things that you have to discern, as we've seen from von Clausewitz, in ways that most of the times have a few to do with theory, that theory can help with, but that is not going to solve them for you at that moment. So naturally, always picture here that von Clausewitz has a dramatically, limited opinion of the importance of theory, right? Theory is naturally what needs to be studied, especially when things really get complicated, where you really have imponent military systems. You need to realize many things that you can't leave just to the individual mind, and that must collect therefore this enormous set of notions coming from the direct experience and how to make an army work, right? But at the same time, when we're talking about command, the theory of the art of war proper, von Clausewitz says this theory is, the furthermost actually from any concrete direct application most of the times, compared to many other activities. That is, for example, in the way making the army work, aside from combat, right? That's a fairly easy thing to do. I mean, it's still very complex, but it will not present that huge detachment, the gap between prescription and reality, that the theory of the art of war, that is chiefly and exclusively of command in this regard, actually presents, right? And not just in the military field, but also in many others, for the reasons that we have explained throughout all the series that now we don't repeat, because that's nauseating at a certain point. But we have observed, this dramatical mix of, what is at stake in war, what is the pressure that you have at the moment, and what in that regard is the limit, the nosological limit of what the hell is going on in the first place. So war in this regard is probably the field of human activity from which this necessity of drawing a theory that is dramatically close to practice reaches probably the highest level of development, because it stems from a practical necessity, but it's so overwhelmingly such an overwhelmingly devastating and imprescriptible experience in many ways that theory is also by itself in absolute terms of knowledge of very, very small use. Yet that can make a difference, naturally. The idea is naturally that in the theory you should contain all of those notions that let's say don't make you spend, that shouldn't require to you a direct experience to understand, which in war, once again, it's not the case, because direct military experience is the best one, especially the more you rise through the ranks, right? Because a general and a soldier have two dramatically different views of war, and it's absolutely false that the soldier actually understands it's better. It's literally the least aware individual. It doesn't matter how much he suffers directly with what experiences. It's not an excuse to pretend to know what war is at the top, right? And the intellectual and moral and rational resources that are required at that level, that are really immense, right? Some of the greatest generals in history were great minds. They were not necessarily geniuses. That's also what von Clausewitz says, but they were necessarily massive minds that had to process such an enormous amount, not just of let's call it systemic, complexity, but also an enormous moral responsibility. Contrarily to what is commonly believed, that generals always get away with their mistakes. It's not quite reality on average in history. But these are deeply rooted prejudices that stem in fact by an overwhelming ignorance about warfare in the first place and how it works in its mechanisms that go beyond the emotionalism, or the I don't even know how to define this, but this idea that what you feel is essentially it has a greater importance than what reality fundamentally is. That's a huge deal that we have in our time. It will have necessarily to resolve, because if that's not done, or at least it's not contained, that's the best recipe for disaster, literally, right? So where were we here? Yeah. So that was the point. I don't remember where I started digressing, but I think we covered what we had to say. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, but where no such theoretical truth is to be found, I add in parentheses, literally all the times, the inquiry must be pushed up to the original elements. Right, so once again, you must revert from theory to criticism, right? And that's what really happens all the time. I want to stress this, because with that put ever the word "and" to a political military study, right? Yes, objectively, I mean, there are certain historical fields in which an overwhelming amount of information is being analyzed, and synthesis is made out of them, and there is a general shared consensus, right? But nothing theoretically, in fact, is, but also literally, physically, mathematically, is beyond discussion, right? It's not a right. It's literally that we don't understand reality fully, so that there's always some margin for expanding, right? That issue. And von Clausewitz says, if this necessity occurs often, it must lead the historian, according to the common expression, into a labyrinth of details. And this is true. Yeah, this is the living hell in which historians are in, right, all the time, because we have this dramatic difficulty in even, setting the boundaries of what the inquiry should be. That is an enormous problem. Also, if anything, from a methodological point of view, because here we're not faring in in means, methods, and competences that all come, first of all, have some degree, first of all, of immediacy of absolute understanding of what the issue is. History is never like that, but also it comes from different people, right, that have different opinions all the time. And this is literally a labyrinth of details, because the details here should be, as von Clausewitz has said, theoretically reconnected through the search of the link-cause effect, and the the speculation in part of how this means could have been used otherwise. But the problem is that our knowledge is so poor about everything of all of this that we can come out with better or worse answers, but that's never going to be the truth, right? Here we will not discuss, because we do it on other videos, on Schwerpunkt, I mean, the historical problem and all the implications that this has heavily on politics, on society, right? This is true, right? History has a dramatic impact on society. We're not really prone to recognize this. We think of historians, maybe, I don't know, as just, yeah, maybe people, there is a high, appreciation towards the figure of the historian, but we rarely think that the historians effectively change mindset of societies. Actually, historiography has a massive impact on the way people look at their politics, their society, their, in fact, the same history, right? Through the same history. And history is written by historians, not by people. Then people can have dramatically, historically inaccurate understanding of history, but still certain thoughts and, inclinations stem from historiographical interpretations, right? That are definitely biased by themselves, for sure. And then von Clausewitz says he, the historian, then has his hands full, and it is impossible for him to stop to give the requisite attention everywhere. Right? This is very important, and this is exactly what we have just told. That first of all, we can't solve the problem, right? If you really had to solve the problem, you wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, this is a problem, for example, every time I make a video, right? But every time you write a thesis, it's the same exact thing. You say, first question, where the hell do I have to start from? And it makes me laugh sometimes. You hear people say, well, but with military history, that's fairly easy because you have just to study the campaign and when operations started or for a battle where combat started. Yes, okay, so you should start, from out of the blue, without any context, without any. How can you explain the thing in the first place? This is an enormous problem, especially for wars. I mean, I understand battles. I mean, battles are easier in that regard to approximate, right? But at the same time, some further and substantial understanding about tactics should be brought forward. Still, strategic implications have massive impact, even in the development of battle. But where do you start with that, with a campaign? Right? You have to start from the strategic scenario, and that's unavoidably tied to politics and society. Where does, conflict stem from? Where does enmity between those two, policies, whichever they are, stem from? And how do you classify, who's ruined there? This is an enormous methodological problem, and it has, once again, an enormous impact in the way we look at history, because certain approximations are obviously done on a biased base, right? So if you were, in theory, if you were to be perfectly accurate in that regard, there are no boundaries. You should, actually, even a human life is not enough. There is no way out of it. You should know literally everything. Nobody knows literally everything, but not even a minimal fraction of it, right? Even if the object of inquiry is naturally limited in itself, and that helps, fortunately, but it still can, and here's the point von Clausewitz eventually, comes with a conclusion, and generally speaking, but we have already encountered before, that is, naturally there are, that things in war are simple. It's just what's behind that is really not. So a lot of the way also we explain certain things is, first of all, to look at those major, especially cause-effect relations that are very important in that regard, which also entails how do you do it. But you go by approximation, it's evident. But also having the humility of leaving open a lot of questions that sometimes could be even too many, right? And that's where we get now with criticism that we've read before, because there are hypotheses, right? There are theories within the, how things have gone, right? And there is naturally some evidence to substantiate certain theories. Maybe are compatible with the picture, right? But maybe are not compatible with each other. So evidently one of the two at least is wrong. And von Clausewitz writes the consequence of this is that in order to set bounds to the historian investigation, he has to adopt some arbitrary assumptions, which, if we in fact do not appear so to him, do so to others, as they are not evident in themselves or capable of proof. This is also very important, because here we have repeated fundamentally what we just said in part, but there is this other element of von Clausewitz highlights now that we haven't touched, that is, the historian also can convince himself, and believe me, it happens all the times, that one explanation, that can be a theory, is a good one, or at least there is an assumption, and that's even worse, that of things that you give somewhat for granted, for no justified reasons, right, that you eventually write, and that others say, but why is this the case? And this could be, it's not that the historian in this regard is always making a mistake, right? There can be, this happens to me, it happened many times actually, that I developed a certain awareness about, from the sources, about certain topics, right, certain issues, right, and I develop one opinion of mine, and then it happens to you that others come to you and criticize you because they say, but this doesn't convince me, and you say, okay, well, why does it convince you? Because this and that, and you realize that then that this and that is not much something, it's actually wrong, right, but you have explained that it's wrong, maybe elsewhere, that is connected to that theory. So you have a problem because you have also been able to explain why this and that are wrong, and why your theory actually has something to tell, because, and this is frustratingly frequent, especially when you discuss about things that you know first, that this is because you led a certain inquiry on a topic that normally other people don't know. So that is a serious academic issue that happens all the time, especially today when there's literally an overflood of papers that is frankly a disgusting and useless and stupid thing. This degenerate, let's be honest about it, it's an economical thing, right? All these call for papers are just an excuse to make money, to have a bunch of, of idlers to have a few articles in their curriculum. That's literally it, right? The quality of articles in academia is sinking. It's sinking. It's there are certain national academies in the West that haven't produced anything valuable in tens of years, and I'm not kidding, right? We arrived to the point where we're wasting an enormous amount of resources, and also because we do very tiny things, and we have lost a perspective on big issues that maybe are more difficult to frame, but that at the same time offer more evidence, and they're by scale more important, right? So sometimes there is many scholars, also by certain per individual, for personal reasons, that they are really blind to a lot of actually good stuff that comes from a few people, that is actually good because it's backed by evidence. It's a good theory, but it passes through all the others because we are getting simply used not to give too much credit about the system, because we know how it works, right? And there is this hypocrisy behind it that it pretends that these are such highly sophisticated required researches. No, our researches in the Western world may be the best around the world, but they're dramatically low for the absolute standards that levels of historiographical development have reached in general in our in certain peaks of our civilization that are there to be simply imitated, right? It's never, I can tell you this, never have faith in and trust and confidence in a person just because we have a title, right? Because it's never a wise thing to do. And this is the trick of history, that it's like war. I mean, there are certain aspects of it that are really, especially about communicational strategies and how you look at the chaos that of information in the way it is, that is, by the way, dramatically useful also for actually political and military issues, right? Don't think that this doesn't have consequences in the way we look at the world now, and the value of information, and how the criterion of analyzing this. And the sad thing is that criterion is often built just by the people who are competent about what is to be judged, and that's the serious problem. Like, and it happened many times in history, right? And there are definitely also non-academic interests involved. I mean, academies are full of politics, full of economical interests, and that's utterly disgusting. Once again, maybe it's what it makes them work, right? I don't want to sound an hypocrite myself saying, okay, well, so we should just write for the pleasure, of what? Of an absolute truth. Of course, we need to be motivated in some way, but at the same time, there doesn't seem to be so much internal checking to certain dynamics. But this is a completely different topic, and I mean, it's connected to this evidently because I came up with reading this, but I don't. We will have to discuss it on another time. But the point that is really connected to this, though, is that von Clausewitz is saying that theoretically everybody can question everything. This is not always a good thing, right? This is a potential, right, thing that exists, but at the same time, an excessive criticism towards a certain idea that doesn't picture it in its substance, but just in petty details, we can say, can be dangerous, very dangerous. And he goes on and says, a sound theory is therefore an essential foundation for criticism, and it is impossible for it, without the assistance of a sensible theory, to attain to that point at which it commences chiefly to be instructive, that is, where it becomes demonstration, both convincing and sans réplique. So this is, one side of one extreme, if you want. That is, in this part from Clausewitz is showing you how much criticism effectively needs a theory, right? This is true. We can't start without someone else's help in this world, right? We need it. We are structured in this way, and the way we learn things since we're little, and up to the highest levels of education, you do need to know what others have thought, written, read, right? Then there is evidence. There is another matter, and in my opinion is possibly more important than just 50-50, right? That's just me. The point here is that theory in itself has an authority, that even if we don't want to recognize that, right? It's typical in many ways for people to be conservative when they accept that they have to delegate, that they fundamentally accept someone who is doing the work for them, right? And therefore they say, okay, this thing so far is working overall, so let's not dismantle it. So it's typical to be, instead, less this is not liberal conservative, but it's the idea of more propositive, more iconoclastic in some way, when instead you get to the point in which you actually realize what that establishment is about. You see that there is something that does not work, right? And that hopefully you know how to fix, right? Not to destroy, as it's unfortunately coming up today, seemingly, that we should raise to the ground everything we have. Everything is bad, everything is evil. No, evidently not. Hierarchies are very functional. We all need hierarchies pretty massively and heavily, and society cannot work without hierarchies and establishments. The point, though, is that this can be improved, right? And normally just a few people have the competence each in their own field to improve it. And that's why it's also very different to challenge theory, and it's very fascinating, especially if you read. Yes, of course, we're talking about Vom Kriege, so you can read. But I was thinking about the last video, that is in which the one in which, or was it? No, I actually was the end of the four. It's the one before this. The second before this. Which von Clausewitz talks about how following theory to the latter brought to massive disasters. Well, so that's actual history. Von Clausewitz is talking, of course, about the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt that brought the destruction of Prussia at the hands of the French in this battle, the two battles, if you want. But that basically annihilated the Prussian army and destroyed fundamentally if anything, the trust, the confidence they had in the Friedrichian doctrine at that point, the bleak order and such things, because they were outdated. So that's a pretty damn good example, right? That I'm generally conservative, so I have no problem in this regard. But it's obvious that there are massive historical examples that military history especially bring on the fore quite dramatically, in which there are systems that cannot last forever because they can arrive to harm, right? And especially when you pretend that these systems, maybe it wasn't bad in itself, but it was applied blindly, right? Just doctrinally. That's what von Clausewitz himself is saying. So that's the point of the story, that this idea of sans réplique is definitely an extreme by itself, right? There can't be a theory without possible criticism, without possible improvement, right? Or debate, because that's also what happens in a certain sense, in a corporative, professional, I don't know, to say level, that, someone touches someone's theory, that theory is sacred, can't be touched, right? Instead, it happens all the times that theory holds, right, even when some people start to say that it was wrong, because there is a certain amount of people who are not competent in those fields that people are finding out that can demolish that theory, and then eventually this theory it erodes from the within, and one day it simply disappears, and everybody accepts instead what that before was not, let's say. There's never really a mainstream either, right? There is never even in here a theory that is effectively shared or understood or accepted by everyone in the same way. There's never been in history a single text of any single type that's been interpreted in an identical way between a person and another. Like, every single person has a different idea of interpretation of whichever you present to that person. And it's always the case. So that I think let's not go as far as that. But it's obvious that the awareness, at least, of this dimension must be there at all times, right? You should know, if you are interested in any theory, if you're in higher education, whichever you want to find out, research, and debate and whatever, present to others, is that you should be flexible as much as you wish the others to be flexible, always knowing that also the opposite is true, that you also have to present something that holds, that it has a certain solidity, and also the others will present one. So initially, also in here, let's not digress, but it's very easy to contest something, right? Especially when you begin to look at things that you've never known of, because you realize that you came from a background that, had never presented these things to you, and then you're surprised. So you need sometimes to blame even someone else, an imaginary enemy, to say, people believe that. How much time do you say this on Schwerpunkt? It's not fully correct, because it's true that many people believe whichever stupid thing here we criticize, but also there are lots of people who are aware of that, and that there's also middle ground for which, we're at least able to improve. But there are situations in which these decisions are about very, very serious issues, and it's not just a matter of philosophizing about this thing, it's really about the fact you have to act upon them, and von Clausewitz was perfectly aware of this, as he had seen the older Prussian doctrine being applicated literally, and ending up in a massive disaster. And this thing, by the way, happened again and again in many circumstances. Like, you don't have to, even the same von Clausewitz, interestingly enough, has been misinterpreted. That's yet another thing, because von Clausewitz never ran out of anachronism, right? It's just people who have had great problems of interpreting that, because they they crystallize, in fact, on certain notions that they pretended they could, you know, put at the same level of this method that is ultimately all what he's presenting here, right? So that also shows you how dramatically easy it is to take a theory and misinterpreting it or bending it to your aims, or not fully understanding, having the patience of listening to it at its deepest. And that's why from 1 year I'm doing this, we arrived just at 1/3 of the Vom Kriege, right? Because we need serious inquiries. We need to fully understand what we're discussing in the first place before judging. Von Clausewitz has showed us in the last video how we do need, I mean, definitely the critical narrative does entail a judgment, necessarily, that history is to be judged, right? It's not a mere passive thing like, okay, you can't judge, right? We can judge. The problem is that very often we judge poorly, and from the top of certain misconceptions and prejudices and complexes that we know, in fact, that are stupid, right? We can't contextualize most of the times. We are obsessed, especially a certain part of the Western world is literally obsessed with the moralistic judgment of history. Right, one thing is moral judgment of history is perfectly fine, but the idea of judging everything in black and white simply because, you know, one is bad, one is good, right, good and evil, right? Yeah, that, I don't know, there's, for example, this leads to massive misconceptions like that people who are the top of society are generally tyrants, or egomaniacal degenerates, and the rest of the people is so candid and pure, right? Most of the times they're both disgusting people, right? But there is also good in them, and that's also what makes society somewhat improve. But it's very difficult to have a fair balance if you need to start from preconceived notions that you assume without autonomous criticism, right? And in fact, von Clausewitz now talks about the other side of the story. That is, okay, respect theory, because know that theory is rich, right? We are arrived also in a time in history in which we definitely know a lot, right? In the last generations, historiographically speaking, we have overly expanded, even, I think, our historiographical, inquiries, sometimes even not to great benefit, so that we incurred in those problems we were talking about before, that we also have a problem to orientate ourselves in all the stuff that there is, and we can't read everything. We need to rethink even certain approaches to history, and especially for the sake of, political and social education, right? We can't once again think history is just a case of people who do strange things at universities, and then society should, or politics especially, shouldn't care, because history has an enormous civic importance, right? It's not the entertainment channels on YouTube, right? As this is definitely not an entertainment channel. It's not even remotely conceived as one, right? So von Clausewitz says, but it would be a visionary hope to believe in the possibility of a theory applicable to every abstract truth, leaving nothing for criticism to do but to place the case under its appropriate law. Right? This is powerful, right? He says, yeah, theory is important. It comes from a pile of notions that we have built with great difficulty over time, and that great minds have revolved around to perfectionate, etc. So you must know that. But don't think, even for once, not even for once, that you can't put aside criticism because a book, a scholar, whichever other authority said so. Because by definition, by our physical understanding of the world, this is by definition impossible. So this doesn't mean, once again, we should tear down hierarchies. This doesn't mean we should context authority just for the sake of it. That's dangerous, irresponsible. It damages society. a lot, right? And we are through that since especially some generations. It's not healthy. It doesn't seem it has helped objectively. From a moral point of view, it's been largely disruptive. But cum grano salis, of course, we should always be critical, we should always be skeptical, right? Not skepticist, but skeptical, and it's always healthy, always, right? So, von Clausewitz here is talking naturally about the theory of the art of war, and he says, fundamentally, that here we have a concrete example that as we have seen before, throughout all these years, there is no manual, no theory that tells you, even remotely closely in war, what you will face at one point, so that you can cope with it decisively. Not even once. And at the same time, this is implied is that also there is someone at a certain level who can also understand these things. As we were saying before, there is an enormous difference between what the soldier understands, what the general understands. So it's very unlikely for a soldier to be able to write a new manual, doctrinal manual for divisional command, right? Right. Maybe that soldier brought in that position would write, but he still wouldn't have the direct experience for that. He would have to maturate through a specific training, education, right, formation, etc. And it's a massive, it's very difficult, right? What I would like to always to reflect on with the Vom Kriege is that unfortunately these things cannot, I mean, what von Clausewitz is writing here cannot be realized until you don't make that sacred thing that is that, studying a single battle or better a campaign with all the sources existing and spending literally a big part of your life, can be 1 year, even some months depending, but at that level of serious work, of serious inquiry, to understand all the massive difficulties that we have to interpret history and war as we are studying it specifically. You can't get to that awareness. You can't take this book as a doctrine by itself if you don't pass through that. Because if you have nothing to do with the military or with military history, objectively this read can be very fascinating, especially if you understand, if you study it. This is not to be read, this is really to be studied, to be understood in the first place. But that you would somewhat miss the capacity of doing. It's like, I don't know, reading a manual how to drive a car, and without actually driving one, right? And there is a big difference. There are certain things that until you don't drive that car, you will never understand. Even if you have read about them, this is the one powerful realization that we have about so many other subjects, that direct experience is dramatically more useful than any theoretical teaching, that however we still need since the beginning to realize, to frame that experience. We will get into already a favorable structure that, it's favorable because it helps to in fact frame better this knowledge in a functional way, right? That's why we teach things in schools or in university in a certain way. It's more like a structure that we want to give. Then eventually the individual has to fill that structure with actual knowledge also by him or herself, right? It's very important. That's what we lost also the realization of doing. Like, you can't pretend that your kid is going to be educated just because you send him or her to school. It doesn't make sense if you don't back the child with something consistent. But school will not grow them for you, right? It's inconceivable. The same goes for university. Do you think that people who go to university to take a degree are actually people that you can trust about that subject in everything? Right, by approximation, yes, because those are theoretically, on average, the people who understand better that stuff. But that by itself, as a title, doesn't give you, even if you're a professor, that it happens all the time. Anybody who has gone to university has met professors made mistakes, sometimes even pretty bad ones. Why? Because they're ignorant in general, they're incompetent. Well, generally not. They're generally very competent people, but they can have misconceptions, right? It's not just a lapsus. I mean, some are very massive structural misconceptions that happen because simply we can't know everything, but also sometimes we don't even know a tiny part of the thing, even if we have spent decades studying them. So once again, this would be an interesting field to expand, but it's a moral problem. This is what I would like to make you understand. It's not like Don Quixote charge against windmills. It's that societies have grown historically, always realizing that next to the tool, there has to be some substance to work on. If you get the tool without substance, you're worthless. I mean, really. And this is sadly true also from a general economical perspective. We have to work of something concrete. We can't think it's society, reality is just about ideas. We need reality. We need to be concrete, right? Just applicate our knowledge. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, it would be ridiculous pedantry to lay down as a rule for criticism that it must always halt and turn around reaching the boundaries of sacred theory, right? Boundaries of sacred theory do not quite exist, right? And here, von Clausewitz also at one point, if I'm not wrong, if we have read it, makes this kind of contamination consideration that is effectively that we always jump through the stuff. We in and out because we constantly need to go back to theory, but to connect it to the practice we're dealing at the moment. Otherwise, what's theory for? And theory is not always gonna, most of the times, it's not gonna solve the problem for you, right? This is why many people misunderstand this whole work sometimes and others, because they think that this is the Bible in the sense that everything that is contained in them is all they need. No. With the Bible as well, what you need there is it's a powerful philosophical system, but what you do in your life is what effectively matters, and you don't know the answers most of the times. So that's where your responsibility, your ethical problems start, because you are the one who makes the difference. Like, you can't blame other people. It's very easy to blame other people for your own failures, and that will never make you grow as an individual. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, the same spirit of analytical inquiry, which is the origin of theory, must also guide the critic in his work, right? In other words, it's like a circle, right? Theory is born out of these inquiries, and that's where it goes back herself, right? Because theory is updated constantly, just as doctrine. The doctrine that stems from it. And then von Clausewitz writes, and it can and must therefore happen that he strays beyond the boundaries of the province of theory and elucidates those points with which he is more particularly concerned. Right? So this is interesting because von Clausewitz is saying here that the historian has to confront with as if he had to get in theory and test whether his own hypothesis holds, right? Or if it even expands the boundary of theory in that regard, right? This happens all the time. It's happening to me right now, that there are certain issues that have been discussed for a long time. Nobody has much done a comprehensive work about this. I'm practically doing it, and my modest means, and it turns out that a lot of things that were written before, because that we knew that they could be different and that they required more research, more inquiry. In fact, also are corrected in the sense that certain hypotheses that were thrown out because they seemed too easy, or at least too optimistic, can be actually backed with a consistent amount of evidence that shows a great systematization of certain phenomena. So who knows how this will be accepted if I manage to finish this, because that's also, I hope, really to add a step more, like to certain the awareness of that certain part of military history. And to me, I would be proud of that, but it's not because of my personal glory, right? It's literally because I think that this has a utility of some sort, that it can make us understand something better about the world we have lived in, and this goes to the benefit of a broader understanding of the possibilities of how, even in fact, expanding a boundary, especially when there is a resistance, is somewhat inspiring for others. Right? We are usually inspired by people who said, but I said the thing, I knew it, and they try to demonstrate it. Instead, they were trapped, they were impeded because, there was a wall put in front of him because they didn't want to know about what could damage their theory. I'm not in this situation at all, so it's a much minor thing than it sounds, but just for saying that in its scale, it's fundamentally something like of that kind. And I'm worried because if they say, okay, I don't understand your work because it's too long, it's too complex, I don't have the time to spend time studying it, right? That's an issue, because it's as if you went to Von Clausewitz and wrote something. There's a masterpiece, way more complicated than anything I could possibly write personally. And this thing, the Vom Kriege has been obstacled fiercely at the time. Now, all the world militaries are fundamentally based on the Clausewitzian theory. And it keeps being so. In a way or another. I mean, the military thinking is founded on this, on the Vom Kriege, all over the world, and that's, von Clausewitz never knew that because he eventually died before he could even finish the work. But he knew, he died writing, as we have seen at the introduction of this, he died writing in a note that we don't know what he wrote that, probably when he was already sick of cholera, and he said, okay, I will probably not make it, but I want to let you know, to his wife and friends and his generals, the Academy of Berlin, where he taught this stuff, that I want you to know, even if this comes out incomplete, I think that the essentials are right. And he was right. And that's the most moving thing. I can't think this person, I don't know, I've never visited von Clausewitz's tomb. It's something I want to do, because it sucks, because I was actually pretty close to his native town, so I could pass there, stop by, but I couldn't at that specific moment. But to me, that's a massive inspiration, because for what he lived through, for what he thought. I mean, who knows, maybe if I had met him in person, I would have detested him. I have no idea of this, but what he did for humanity has changed, the entire world. And not because, von Clausewitz has literally changed the history of Europe, of the world, right? And not because it's his direct fault of inspiration, but he brought to united Germany. He brought to the Bolshevik Revolution. Literally, I'm not kidding, right? These are all consequences. So the work of this man shaped our world, right? I'm not saying that these things are necessarily positive or negative. I'm saying that people studying his military theory managed to apply this also in their political theory. Famously, communists and socialists, in the 20th century have always had a sound Clausewitzian education. This has nothing to do with von Clausewitz being associated to communism in any way, right? This is true also for United Germany, for the Second Empire, with this thing. Even with the Germans that were thinking to follow von Clausewitz, they lost 2 world wars because they misunderstood him. Right, it's not his fault, right? And fortunately so, because it probably would have not been better, especially with World War II. But what I'm saying is that that we have an enormous responsibility, with dealing with these ideas. Right? Ideas are not just mere abstractions. They are soundly connected in the way effectively even our material world works. And von Clausewitz is a great proof of this. Yeah, and von Clausewitz goes on, it says, in this period that of analytical inquiry can and must therefore happen. In this context we have traced that the historian strays beyond the boundaries of the province of theory and elucidates those points which, have we ever already read it, which is more particularly concerned? Right, yes, we did. Excuse me for the repetition, but okay, it doesn't do any harm. Yeah. So it's somewhat the historian's task to perfection theory, because there is no other way to do it, by the way, and that's how theory is formed in the first place. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, it is more likely, on the contrary, that criticism would completely fail in its object if it degenerated into a mechanical application of theory. Right? So here von Clausewitz says it pretty straightly. Yeah, if you were to applicate theory blindly, in practice there wouldn't even be any criticism at that point. It would be a disaster. Theory can't be applied mechanically. Right? This is a powerful statement that has to do with the criticism to Jomini, the principle of internal lines, this geometrization of war that is sound most a distant tool for an effective theory of the art of war. And that at the time had a great weight, because many other generals actually liked pretty much what Jomini had written. And Jomini was a pretty smart, he was a great mind as well, right? And he was so much, in fact, that he recognized to be wrong at the end when he lived long, right? Von Clausewitz died but much before. But Jomini recognized that von Clausewitz was a genius and that he was right. So that his own theories, Jomini's theories were wrong. And it takes a great heart and mind to say that. That's why Jomini is a great man, and also why actually it would be much more useful to read Précis de l'art de la guerre before the Vom Kriege, to dismantle completely, even if you were not aware of, if you hadn't systematized them even before, as positivistic and kind of approach to the theory of the art of war, Jomini's ideas, and then pass it to von Clausewitz, that shows you something very, very, very different. And it's funny because also Jomini criticized initially von Clausewitz, so we know that it was this bitterness, but we've said how it ended. Von Clausewitz goes on and writes, all positive results of theoretical inquiry, all principles, rules, and methods are the more wanting in generality and positive truth, the more they become positive doctrine. Right? So naturally, if something works, if something has its own value, leave it the way it is, and if if that starts creating problem, then criticize it. Right? And this goes in parallel as an operation all the time. But you always have to also to tribute that significance to the theory in itself. It's not just there to be criticized, but it's there also to teach you something. The von Clausewitz writes, they exist to offer themselves for use as required, and it must always be left for judgment to decide whether they are suitable or not. As we just said, right? So be open, right? Do both things. Learn from theory and from practice alike. That's why the Vom Kriege is so important. Is why before I was telling you that you should always, in parallel, naturally study military history in a very historical sense, right? Methodologically speaking, because it's paradise for understanding warfare in that regard. If you really want to know how you can learn about it, you must do that. And it's, I mean, it obviously costs, but that's we know that's the best way, right? So if you jump around the internet and videos like mine or other channels that you think, oh, now I'll get it, just know that the only way to get it is to do that exercise, do that activity, for which you should read Von Clausewitz on your own, study Von Clausewitz on your own, aside from me. Of course, I'm ashamed of having to say this, but I really don't want any equivocal in this regard. Right? We know what needs to be done. This is also what is a problem in today's world, that we arrived at a level of development for which it seems to me that the average people, they completely ignore the consequence. Like, we know how to do well so many things today, and how many people care about studying how to do things well? Not so many, after all. Von Clausewitz writes, such results of theory must never be used in criticism as rules or norms for a standard, but in the same way as the person acting should use them, that is, merely as aids to judgment. Beautiful phrase, aids to judgment. That's what the theory of the art of war is. Has to be on the general's closet, but what the general does in the field is largely autonomous from that book. Going on, if it is an acknowledged principle in tactics that in the usual order of battle, cavalry should be placed behind infantry, not in line with it, still it would be folly on this account to condemn every deviation from this principle, right? Indeed, I mean, if you look at the complexity of a Napoleonic battlefield as the ones in which von Clausewitz fought, I mean, yes, the general principle, given that specific moment in history, the relative art of war, yes, generally speaking, it's the line of musketeers that bears the heavier, load of action and destruction, etc. But cavalry is better held in reserve to intervene in the gaps, to exploit, to encircle, whatever. But this basically doesn't tell anything whether you should always follow that deployment. There are moments in which cavalry is put on the fore with great advantage, right? I mean, even in that specific time, meaning that, of course, if you were talking about 13th century warfare, that would be the norm in there. But here we're talking about a doctrine that, in this regard, comes from it's of a theory that eventually emanates a doctrine in a certain specific time in history, where that doctrine is applicated at the moment, right? It's not that today's military necessarily studies what 13th century armies were, right? They should, because they actually would understand a lot of things, even about today's warfare. But the point is that what they mostly need to know is how combat works today, which is not in the general lines, in the essentials, in these general principles, actually different from the medieval world. That this is what is difficult sometimes to teach and to realize what the theory of the art of war fundamentally is, right? Because people start from the bottom of in the scale of importance, right? They're obsessed with weapons and equipment, things like that, and just the tactics in itself. But when you rise in the scale, that's where war has never changed. And because it's the essence of it that had never changed. It will never change. So that's why also this work is so functional still today. Because it shows you a theory and a method alike. Then, going on, criticism must investigate the grounds of deviation. This is very important as well, and it is only in case these are insufficient that it has a right to appeal to principles laid down in theory. This is very mathematical, very physical, if you want, right? There is a bulk of a core of notions that we think that at least are, in the world we live in. It's very interesting with physics, right? With physics, is showing us that our knowledge about the universe is getting weirder and weirder, but heavily so. Still, we're ever more aware of what the hell happens in the space of the in the place of the universe in which we live. This is a fitting comparison, so that it's you, and even in here you don't give for granted even the world you live in, because we know that we don't know much of the world we live in after all. But at the same time, there is a set of theories, the general physics in itself, that tells us more or less what we need to know in order to live the way we do, approximately in this regard. But still, we concentrate in the research at the periphery of this, at the periphery in the sense that what is obviously better known, that works better, because it works better, because that law works, right? We give for assumed, or at least as something that is always acceptable from a scientifically healthy perspective to inquiry, but then we expand in those, in fact, deviations, as von Clausewitz puts in here. There are those things that don't add up, right? That we still have to sort out and trying to understand. So the deviation here, I think von Clausewitz is also talking about something else. That is, always remember that in that regard, physics doesn't have a prescriptive thing. Physics is probably one of the most it's a bit of a paradox. It has more of a mechanical understanding that it has in its kind of moral implications, right? It's as if there was an attachment between what needs to be known and what eventually you will do with that. In things like war, it's very, very different. But whatever we're talking about social affairs in this regard, each and every one of this knowledge will have massive impact, right, on people's lives. This is also very important with having a healthy relation with science. That is, science is good. It's the best thing we have, possibly. But at the same time, we don't have to fall into the delusion that it can solve all the problems we have, or that it's actually doing it, in the sense that there are greater political and social problems, for example, than the scientific ones. This seems strange, but if you actually analyze the potential of discovery and practical implications that certain studies have, well, it would be better to invest certain resources in having, civic education, for which the same science could largely benefit, rather than thinking that there is just one tool that can solve everything. Because even science in itself is telling us that, there is an enormous room for improvement, but that this comes very slowly. And the problem why improvements come slowly is that a theory must also have an adequate field of application. The same goes with doctrine in war. You can even there have been military technologies, for example, just talking about actual science in this regard, that study, I don't know if you have ever known about the French mitrailleuse, but look at the story of that. I mean, that was such a freaking advanced weapon for the time, that in the 1870s, where it was adopted against the Prussians, its doctrine couldn't be of application, couldn't be still enacted, because it was so ahead that even if the gun was a freaking marvel and a massive thing, it couldn't fit an adequate employment until World War I. So that tells you also how much our scientific achievements are not necessarily what eventually it doesn't automatically get transposed into our political and social achievements. And we largely live of political and social achievements, not of strictly scientific ones. And it turns out actually the scientific ones are triggered by political and social things, right? This is also a very difficult thing, that people believe that technologies made us live better. No, it's the massive effort of societies that struggle and work and produce that allowed eventually technology to exist in the first place. Because without that, technology by itself doesn't serve anything. If you don't have an adequate field of application, technology is literally useless. The same goes with weapons in war. You can't think that you can win a war because you have the best guns. Because if you don't find, once again, an adequate field of application of those guns, you will be defeated anyway. So the eternal myth of technology unfortunately recurs, and studying von Clausewitz is quite a powerful demolisher also of this idea. Even if there is not, I think, a direct reference or specific part of the work dedicated to dismantle it expressly, but the point is that if you don't know what to do with your things, you can have a lot of things, but those are useless for you, and you are also somewhat useless, right? With the only difference that you can at least understand the mistake you made and doing something about it, because those things you have will not solve it for you. The grounds of deviation, right? Because the exception is always fascinating, and I would say to that, I'm also studying an exception in my current work, and the beauty of exception is that it reveals that sometimes even the grounds of other of other theories are to be debated, because the exception could not be just something that statistically goes differently, but that it has its own theory behind. That is another thing compared to the one you knew, or at least it's part of it, but you misinterpreted it. So this is very useful, and in war is plenty of this stuff, because effectively there's no battle nor war that is ever been the same. So we fundamentally don't study in reality but deviations. Like, there's not a single thing that goes straight by theory, not even one. But that's also a beauty of theory, that in fact, and that's why it doesn't have to be taken literally or mechanicistically, is that it looks at what certain things have in common rather than how they individually are. And that sets a trend that is useful for this reason, but that you will always have to check case by case. Otherwise, we would have solved our problems. Like, we would be God. We will never be, So I'm sorry, but that's the limited reality we live in, and still we can do a freaking beautiful amount of things with it. So whining about the boundaries of it is losing the entire beauty and luck and grace we have in front of all around you, ourselves, right? And that we always complain about, after all, rather than doing something good with it. Okay, in von Clausewitz writes, it is further established in theory that a divided attack diminishes the probability of success. Still, it would be just as unreasonable whenever there is a divided attack and an unsuccessful issue to regard the latter as the result of the former without further investigation in the connection between the two, as where a divided attack is successful to infer from it the fallacy of that theoretical principle. Yes, we will see further from Clausewitz how important it is in the principles, of war, how the attack should be carried out in concentrated mass. This has nothing to do with the fact that in certain cases you can't do that, and you can't say that maybe in that case the thing failed just because you didn't respect that principle, because that was maybe the best thing you could do actually, but for some other factor, some other principle that went wrong for some other reason, the action failed, right? And why is this the case of this theoretical proof? But of course, because if you don't attack en masse, you can basically be absorbed by the same force of the enemy much more easily, one part by one, right? And not and also physically speaking, you would just somewhat hit in multiple points the enemy. It could work in certain cases, but generally speaking it doesn't compared to a mass attack, right? So once again, there are factors that must tell you why that is the case. Where's the enemy Schwerpunkt, for example? And that's the point, right? It could be in the morale, it could be in the terrain, it could be everywhere, and it changes all the time. We will arrive to the concept of Schwerpunkt, and that's freaking powerful. That's why I entitled the channel like this. Yeah, and then von Clausewitz concludes and says the spirit of investigation which belongs to criticism cannot allow either, right? So you can't think the theory always works, but neither that it never does, right? And you can't flip it because it's always the same. Alright, so for today we stop here. This fifth chapter is quite long, but we'll do our best to. But we're proceeding fairly well. I think we surpassed. We almost arrived. I think we surpassed the 1/3 of the Vom Kriege at this point. So really long. It's a long way to go, but it's still great we achieved this. Alright, so for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.